Welcome to another Sunday Superversive live stream. I am your host, Benjamin Wheeler, and today I'm going to be talking with my co-host, Anthony Marchetta, about the recent article from Ron Unz about Shakespeare, our opinions on it, historical revisionism in general, and just some light interests that we to just be interested in. Anthony, how are you doing today? Anthony, Anthony,
Can you hear me?
Anthony. There we go. We can hear you
Ki-
now.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. I had a weird,
Yes,
like your voice started coming in slow on my end, but I'm here.
excellent. Let me know if that does it again. That might be the game I'm playing. Which is actually I'm
Will
just
do.
gonna stop playing. This is poorly optimized as all get out. Uh, so
Sounds good.
uh, Ron Unz a couple days ago produced an article that was discussed in several circles concerning the true existence of Shakespeare, namely whether he indeed wrote his plays or whether it was somebody else, excuse me, um, which I'm sure will be talked about over the course of this series. We have our opinions. I have my opinions, but Anthony, why don't you go into greater detail for us?
Yeah, so I read the article not expecting to be convinced because Ron Unz is popular among certain circles. Specifically, I know Vox holds him in high regard. Vox holds what he admits openly and cheerfully is a conspiracy theorist view of history. Um, while I do see the merit in what he is saying, I am not as convinced as him. Uh, and Ron Unz is definitely like he's big into, the official story just can't be true. So here's a billion different interpretations. I'm not saying he's not a smart guy. He's clearly like an extremely intelligent person. Uh, I'm just saying that I don't read something by Unz and go, oh yeah, that tracks. That must be true. A lot of the times I read it and go, that sounds fishy. Uh, so I read the article though because I do respect Vox and I respect his opinion. So I wanted to see what was up with it. And you know what? I thought it was actually very very interesting. Uh, it was a fascinating article. Basically the premise of the article is there are some discrepancies in the quote unquote official story of Shakespeare. And the discrepancies, there are a few. One of them is that Shakespeare is he's so the guy who we know as Shakespeare. We're gonna call him the Bard from Avon, right? William Shakespeare. If you look at how he spells his name everywhere else, every time we have a signature from him, he spells it with no E in the middle. He spells it Shakespeare. So this guy, William Shakespeare, was a merchant and an actor who was married to Anne Hathaway, right? Uh, so if why do we have these plays by William Shakespeare when and claiming they're the same guy as William Shakespeare? Now it is true that at the time last names could be somewhat malleable. It's not like today, uh, but nevertheless, like we don't have any like signature from him spelling it with the E, which is a little bit weird. And I'm going through yeah, our solid knowledge of his life and activities is very minor. He did not comment on the death of Elizabeth, which would have been extremely unusual for a major literary figure of the time. So why? Like that's odd. Um, he lived and worked for 51 years in Britain, but he seemed to have existed as a ghost, invisible to his contemporaries. So, which doesn't make any sense since he was actually very like he he was actually like should have been very well known. Like if his plays were popular, so how come he's not? Also, the name Shakespeare is occasionally spelled with a hyphen in the middle of it, which is often used for pseudonyms, even though the spelling was irregular. So, okay. The other problem is Shakespeare seems to know a lot about foreign locales, and he seems to know a lot about foreign places. Now, granted, his a lot is often very made up. Like he'll talk about famously in A Midsummer Night's Dream, he tells the one who was it, Hermia, one of them, get thee to a nunnery, which is also, that's in Hamlet, but he also tells one of them like she's going to run off and be a nun in ancient Greece, which is clear, obviously doesn't really make any sense. I mean, they did have like some sort of virgin things, but they wouldn't have, and in various other plays, like although he'll talk about other locales, it's clear he's just making the knowledge up from the top of his head. Nevertheless, he seems to demonstrate more knowledge of them than we would expect from a person who lived in Britain literally his entire life and never left it, as far as we could tell. Right? There's also the very strange fact that we know for a fact that nobody in his family was literate, and we don't have a single shred of writing, like actual physical handwriting from Shakespeare but his signature, which is a little bit strange for somebody who is like this well known and widely read and popular. So why? How is that possible? So it raises a bunch of issues. Right now, all of these issues have been well known for a while. Alternate people have been proposed. Also, none of these issues are on their own devastating to the Shakespeare theory, right? Like, you could say, well, I was talking with Ben about this. You could easily imagine that the first play that he published, they just happened to spell his name wrong, so we ran with it, right? You could easily imagine that he simply happened to be a very retiring figure. He liked acting and he liked writing, but he didn't like the spotlight. I mean, that's not unheard of. It's unusual, certainly, but not unheard of. So maybe that's why he didn't make a statement on the passing of Elizabeth. Maybe he just didn't want to. Maybe the Shakespeare's Catholic theories are true, and there is some not textual evidence for this, right? Like his family did hide priests, so we know that his family at least had Catholics in it. So we do have some evidence for this. So maybe he didn't feel like giving a tribute to Elizabeth after her death. Maybe he didn't like her, right? Like that's a possibility. But all of this is speculation. And the fact is, and what's really notable here is that we simply don't know that many, we don't have that many facts about him. So one of the most widely favored alternatives is Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, probably the most widely favored nowadays. And some of the arguments advanced are strong for him because he did do some traveling. We do have a great deal of his personal correspondence and early writings. He was well educated, had strong, unlike the Bard from Avon, he had strong literary and dramatic interests. So we're going to call this guy Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford. So we'll call him Oxford. And the production of dramas would have been considered a demeaning and unbecoming pursuit for an important aristocrat like Oxford. So maybe he used a pseudonym like Shakespeare. Shakespeare wasn't that uncommon of a name at the time. It was not uncommon enough that there were like legitimate alternate spellings that could have been confused. So, and if you look at the 154 sonnets, a lot of them are addressed to a youth, a lovely boy, who most scholars regard as a real person, and probably the Earl of Southampton. But it would have been very odd for a commoner to treat a nobleman in so familiar a fashion. And the Bard from Avon was a commoner. The Earl of Oxford was not. It's also that if there's evidence of a homosexual relationship in the sonnets, and By the way, I'm going to say this. There are going to be people who are like, no, there can't be a gay relationship in the sonnets. That's not based at all. There is. I'm sorry. I hate to say it, guys. Chat, it's over. It's so over. Shakespeare's gay. Um, no, but the sonnets are like, this is one of those things where like they're pretty clearly gay. Let's be honest. It's pretty undeniable, and we know we have some. There are rumors at the time that Edward de Vere was gay, so that Oxford was gay. So it does add up, or
Theater kids
homosexual.
never
Should.
change.
What was that?
Theater kids never change.
No. So the case for Oxford as a true playwright isn't very strong, but it's at least plausible, right? There's something there, something to point to, right? And there's other curious things about this, like when it comes to the main thing though that I want to get across is that our evidence that's the bard from Avon, like there is actually very little of it. You know what I mean? Like, sure, they happen to share a similar, not the same name. Sure, he was an actor. He was a merchant and actor. So the historical bard from Avon was an actor. And sure, like Ben Jonson refers to him as being from Avon in a very short dedication, after his death. That's it. That's like all we have, though. We have very little actually pointing to him as the author of the plays. So this is kind of something I want to like get across, and it's kind of the point of the stream, which is that a lot of the times when you see the word scholarly consensus, I'm not saying it's always dishonest, though surely it is often, and or at least sometimes, but you need to be careful what that means, right? There is a scholarly consensus that the bard from Avon is the man we know as William Shakespeare. And you could even say that we have fairly good reason for that consensus. So to say that there is a consensus is true, right? Like, it's absolutely not wrong. There is, in fact, a scholarly consensus that the bard from Avon is the man who we know of as the author of the plays. The problem with this consensus is that when you actually look into it, it's a consensus based on very little actual evidence. When you look at so what is the percentage chance of the bard from Avon being the author of the plays? It's more like a 60% chance or something like, or 65% chance that he's the author. Now, it's true that most scholars agree that there is a 65% chance he's the author, but nevertheless, it's a 65% chance, right? It's almost like the Rotten Tomatoes effect and how Rotten Tomatoes is constantly misused. You look at Rotten Tomatoes and you go, all right, this movie, Black Panther is a good example. Now, Black Panther got shill reviews. We all know that, right? But for a long time, I don't know if it still does, but for a long time, it had a 100% on Rotten Tomatoes. And you go, wow, so it's better than The Godfather, right? Like, no, that's not actually what that means, because what Rotten Tomatoes is doing isn't averaging together all of the reviews to create a number score out of 100. It's saying what percentage of critics gave it even a mildly positive review, right? So if you watch Black Panther and said that was mid, 6 of 10, that goes into Rotten Tomatoes as a positive score, right? And if you watched a movie, and so if you have 100 people who all gave a movie 6 of 10, then it would have a 100% Rotten Tomatoes score and would average a 60% rating from critics, right? But nobody looks at that. They look at the Rotten Tomatoes score. This is sort of similar to that. We are saying that the majority of scholars agree that it's the bard from Avon, but when you actually look into the available evidence, the evidence that it is in fact the bard from Avon is really only at like a 60%. It's just that all the scholars agree, yeah, it's around 60%. So Is the evidence stronger that's Edward de Vere? I mean, based on the article that Unz linked, I would say no. I don't consider the counter arguments particularly compelling. And the story would end here if not for the second half of the article. And this is where things get interesting and a lot more plausible. So it is a well-known historical fact that Shakespeare had multiple sources for his plays, that there were like original versions that Shakespeare then used to make his versions. Hamlet even has its own like Wikipedia article. You know, is like this is an accepted and very well-known historical fact. Romeo and Juliet was based on like another English play that was based on an Italian play that was based on another Italian story, and that guy swore it was based on a true story. So you could tell people that Romeo and Juliet was based on a true story, which is kind
And
of
I
fun.
could absolutely believe that Italians would kill themselves over love.
I could easily believe that there might have been a thing where two feuding families had kids that fell in love. To be honest, this happens all the time. The Hatfields and McCoys intermingled constantly while they were
Yep.
killing each other. There was a great Hatfields and McCoys miniseries, but the one thing that it kind of got wrong was that they would have disowned you for marrying a Hatfield or a McCoy. Actually, they probably wouldn't have, because they did it all the time.
Yep.
Like, you just would have had to pick a side. Once you pick the side, though, like, they would have been okay with it, right? Oh, I married a Hatfield. Great. Is she on our side? Are you joining them or are you joining us? She's joining us. Great. That would have kind of been the attitude. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So as great, and if you haven't seen it, it's a good miniseries. It was like a Kevin Costner miniseries called The Hatfields and the McCoys. So I could easily imagine Romeo and Juliet being based on like two feuding families, and two of the kids fall in love, and then somebody heard the story and said, "Oh man, that would make a great play." Like,
Right.
but whatever. Anyway, the point is, like, now we get to the really interesting part of the article. So the contention is that the actual author of Shakespeare's plays is an extremely fringe pick. So fringe, even though he wasn't like never ever mentioned, almost certainly you wouldn't have heard of him unless you read this article. And that was a man named Thomas North. Like, if you were a scholar in the field, his name might have come up once or twice, right? But if you were a layperson, probably never. So, who is this guy? Well, and why do we think that he is the original Shakespeare? Let me try and find it. Yeah, by the way, it's 94% believe the Bard from Avon is Shakespeare. Sorry, I'm trying to find the section on Thomas North. Yeah, Thomas North by Dennis McCarthy, the original author of Shakespeare's plays. So Sir Thomas North, a learned diplomat, a military commander, an author, and a translator with a background in law, who is best known for his English translation of several, older Latin works, Plutarch's Parallel Lives. So they had there was a discovery back in 2018 that there was an original source for a lot of Shakespeare's plays, an unpublished manuscript by George North, a likely cousin of Thomas, who was a minor figure in the court of Queen Elizabeth and served as her ambassador to Sweden. No actual plagiarism had been involved, but there seemed strong evidence that the playwright had read and been inspired by this discussion of rebels and rebellions, with his plays using many of the same words as appeared in that George North manuscript, doing so in scenes about similar themes and sometimes featuring the same historical characters. So they said, if this proves to be what they say it is, it's a once in a generation or several generations find. So McCarthy and his collaborators undertake a major analysis of Shakespeare's plays using a technological approach. It's long been known that Shakespeare's Roman plays relied heavily upon Norse translation of Plutarch's Lives, with Norse Wikipedia article emphasizing the fact. And McCarthy quoted George Wyndham's introduction to the standard introduction of Plutarch. Shakespeare, the first poet of all time, borrowed 3 plays almost wholly from North. Shakespeare's obligation is apparent in almost all he has written. To measure it, you must quote the bulk of the 3 plays. But their software revealed that the debt was vastly greater than anyone had ever previously realized. Applying this analysis to all of Norse translations and writings yielded the same remarkable correspondences in so many of Shakespeare's other plays, not just the Roman ones. As McCarthy explained in his second chapter, what is truly compelling are the full passages, speeches, and stories taken from North and their persistence throughout the plays. No one has borrowed more from an earlier writer than Shakespeare has from North. In terms of number of lines and passages reused, no published author in the history of the English language has replicated more material from a prior author than Shakespeare has from North. Not during Shakespeare's time and not since. Hundreds of speeches, exchanges, storylines, and descriptions in Shakespeare's plays. So, McCarthy devoted up to 100 pages in the rest of this book, demonstrating his bold claims by documenting this, and the results seem uncanny and absolutely undeniable. Later in the same book, McCarthy described the enormous extent of those matches. More than 200 passages and lines, thousands of individual lines. Even if when we search through the greatest acts of plagiarism in history, we find they are not 1/10 as extensive as Shakespeare's from North, perhaps not 1/100th as extensive. For in order to match the scope of Shakespeare's borrowings, a plagiarist would have to be both neurotically obsessive and prolific, taking from the same author throughout an entire decades-long writing career from his first book to his last. So, there was now, what does this mean? Was Shakespeare a plagiarist? Not necessarily. Let's talk about this option. As all scholars agree, Shakespeare frequently adapted old plays, yet Shakespeare was a literate playwright who worked his quill in all the plays that were attributed to him. But we also know that Shakespeare frequently adapted earlier plays, a fact no scholar denies. Renowned editors and researchers have uncovered evidence for Shakespeare's use of earlier plays in dozens of cases. Some of this evidence includes impossibly early allusions to seemingly Shakespearean plays from the 1560s, 70s, and 80s. Too early for Shakespeare, who was born in 1564, to have written them. For example, the poet Arthur Book references a Romeo and Juliet he had seen on stage in 1562, 2 years before Shakespeare was born. Similarly, contemporaries of Shakespeare repeatedly described Shakespeare as an adapter of old plays. As McCarthy noted, mainstream scholars had long recognized that there had been earlier versions of Shakespeare plays. So the obvious explanation was that all these older source plays had been written by North himself, who heavily drew upon his own previous writings for that purpose, often doing so from memory. Absolutely no plagiarism was involved. Shakespeare then purchased the rights to these existing North plays and adapted them to the public stage, with the degree of adaptation he applied being uncertain, but probably with very large elements surviving intact. So all these great Shakespeare plays could be regarded as a collaborative effort between Shakespeare and North, perhaps even an extremely one-sided collaboration. So, McCarthy spends a lot of the book answering questions raised by the hypothesis. Why didn't North publish the plays during his prime writing years? Well, almost nobody did. North's plays were unlikely to have been produced for the public theater, which only came into successful existence in the latter part of North's career, so there would have been much less potential popular interest in these works. In fact, a lot of Shakespeare's most important plays had almost been lost for similar reasons. Luckily, we found the first folio, or we wouldn't have even known those plays existed. McCarthy confirmed North was known as a playwright. He found a receipt for one of North's plays produced while Shakespeare was just a teenager. So North received money and credit for his plays when he wrote them, but those records do not survive. Nor did Shakespeare or anyone else record the payments he made for the source plays that he much later purchased for adaptation. There's also the obvious question of why Shakespeare didn't adapt and take credit for the plays of other writers. McCarthy answers that he certainly did. Although this is not well known, other plays were all published with Shakespeare's name or initials on the title pages. They were attributed to Shakespeare for more than a century, and up until the latter half of the 17th century, there is no record of anyone questioning their authorship. Since then, scholars and editors have determined that these plays were so inferior and differently styled, they have removed them from the Shakespeare canon. They theorize that Shakespeare's name had been placed upon the title pages by corrupt publishers. In reality, these plays are Shakespeare's adaptations too, and the only reason they seem so un-Shakespearean is that they were not originally written by North. So McCarthy devoted a chapter to the play Arden of Faversham, which is not considered to be part of the Shakespeare canon. A story of a celebrated real-life English murder case of that era. Many scholars believe it should be credited to Shakespeare on grounds of quality and style. But the villainous protagonist who shared, this is the big smoking gun, the villainous protagonist who shared a lot of characteristics with the fictional Lady Macbeth was North's own half-sister. And the play shared more than 100 lines and passages with some of North's other works. McCarthy believed it may have been North's earliest drama, written when the author was still in his early 20s, while he later recycled some of the same phrasings into Macbeth. One section of the book, which he calls the smoking gun, proof of his hypothesis, namely the fact that some of Shakespeare's plays heavily borrowed from an unpublished North travel journal, as well as from one of North's translations before it had been published. Shakespeare himself was very unlikely to have had access to those sources, so he cannot have been the original author of those plays. So McCarthy only briefly alludes to the authorship debate, but he does say that his own hypothesis fell into a different category. The partisans of Oxford or the other proposed canons spent decades searching for textual evidence, but without even looking for that material, he's turned up hundreds of thousands of close matches between Shakespeare and North. Moreover, North was a well-traveled, multilingual scholar who possessed exactly the sort of background we might expect for the author of Shakespeare's plays. McCarthy advanced some plausible arguments that these plays were probably inspired and written during different phases of North's lives, with some of their favorable, more notable elements corresponding to the latter's personal experiences. So the way he frames the hypothesis is pretty clever, and it makes me think that there is actually a chance that this might get some legs, because the way he frames it is, all right, either Shakespeare was a horrendous plagiarist who wants to admit that, or Shakespeare purchased the plays legally, right? Now, there is something else too worth discussing here, and this is Unz says this, and I agree with Unz about this. I actually felt that McCarthy's Thomas North hypothesis dovetailed very nicely with the existing Oxfordian theory. Indeed, it resolved some apparent problems with the latter that remained in the back of my mind. Under the traditional Shakespeare framework, the playwright had continued to work as an actor, even as he wrote 2 or 3 of his brilliant plays every year, and many skeptics had noted the seeming difficulty of maintaining such an arduous writing schedule. By the way, I'm going to pause here and say that actually does not track with me at all. That does not strike me as a particularly difficult schedule. Shakespeare's plays were not long, not compared to a novel. I mean, writing 2 novels a year is, if you know anything about like the pulp era of writers, for example, like people who write more than Shakespeare in a month than in a full Shakespeare play. You know what I mean? What do you think of that, Ben?
I think people exaggerate word count and production quota, partially because not all of Shakespeare's plays are equally good. Some of them I don't go to see. I don't really care to see a Midsummer Night's Dream, or not Midsummer Night's Dream.
What?
Winter's Tale. No,
Oh,
no, no. Midsummer
thank
Night's
God.
Dream. Midsummer Night's Dream's great. No, Winter's Tale. I don't care. I've never seen it. I don't care about any of the characters. Every time I read the description of the story, it doesn't sound fun. There's definitely a quality difference between them. Secondly, Shakespeare, whatever people say about him in this article, was indeed an actor. He was indeed a theater major. Excuse me. Inshallah, I will never say theater major again in my life. But these, he, excuse me. Okay, so there's a difference in quality, right? He wasn't pumping out Hamlet every single time he put pen to paper. So it's reasonable for there to be a difference in quality. It's reasonable for him to create several different plays a year, especially since, what is he doing when he's not doing plays and stuff? Watching TV, checking up on Netflix? No, he doesn't really have as much to do as we do today. So he has plenty of time, even with his kids, even with all the other things going on. Um, he could write 2 or 3 plays in a winter, that he already has the experience to know how all the characters interact with each other, because there are elements of comedy dell'arte within Shakespeare's plays.
Hmm.
What we would call comedy dell'arte in the future. So it's like there's plenty, like it's like when I write a werewolf story for Pinkerton's Ghosts. In reality, I'm not really doing anything that's taxing the writer brain. I am putting together a tense, I'm putting together a hunting scene and a stalking scene, and I'm adding some body horror, and a presto changeo, it's all done. It's how do I want to put it? Like it I don't want to denigrate his work here, but it's like writers whine about their writing more than anything else, more than it being actually difficult. I wrote, several thousand words at a diner today, for a story that I've been working on for weeks. Was I writing every day? Absolutely not. Was I doing anything to it any day besides thinking about it? No. It was just the time to write it all down. So I finished out the story with all the ideas I had in my head, and it's done. It's like, what am I trying to get at? Essentially, I'm saying that while it looks impressive, and maybe for novel writers, it is impressive because they can't, they're not really talking about pulp novel writers. They're talking about writers who are actually trying to produce something deeper than your average bear. Uh, but instead, no, this is a playwright who knows his stuff. An actor who knows his stuff. He's working with other writers, who are probably being paid to work with him, and they might not have much else going on for him. Like it's one of those things where uh, even though it sounds like a lot, what we keep and what we've kept, excuse me, is plenty for the character. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying, like, this is kind of where Unz loses me a lot of the time, and why I'm not as big of a fan of him as Vox is, because it's like all of these things that sound sort of plausible when you hear, and like, well, this is clearly a hole in the theory, and he just takes it as face value as like, no, yeah, that's a hole. Like, I am a writer, and as a writer, I can tell you immediately that saying Shakespeare wrote 2 plays a year while also acting tracks without even a thought, right? Like,
Yeah.
is it impressive? I mean, sure, but on the other hand, the plays are so good that if he had been doing nothing but writing the plays, it would have been equally impressive. Like, they're literally the pinnacle of all English literature. Yes, it was impressive. So,
Right.
however, the fact is, we are literally talking about arguably the greatest literary genius of all time. So, like, is the fact that he wrote 2 friggin' plays a year that unbelievable? Like, no,
Right.
not really. Um,
And again, not every single one of them was Hamlet.
yes, like that's the other thing. So I also, this is the other thing too, where like, by the way, why I'm not as convinced with the Oxford theory, although there are points of plausibility. Like, oh, he was probably talking about the Earl of Southampton, but it would be weird for a commoner to be addressing him that closely. Okay, but did it ever occur to you that people have to work out that it was the Earl of Southampton, meaning that it wasn't actually like given directly to the Earl of Southampton, right? And given that, like, he, anybody could have written that. Like,
Yeah.
I don't really know. I don't know. I'm having a hard time wording this. My point is that yes, if he were actually addressing it to the Earl of Southampton directly, I would find that to be a compelling argument. I am a little bit less convinced, though, of this because Shakespeare didn't address it to him directly. He wrote poems that alluded to this guy, in which case it's like, well, he would never have talked so familiar about him. Like, he's not talking familiarly about him. He's not talking familiarly about him at all. That's the entire point of the of the discussion, is that you need to work out that it's him, meaning it can't really be that familiar, right? Like, maybe he admires him from afar. Maybe he knew people in court. Maybe it's not the Earl of Southampton at all, and you're just wrong. Like, to be honest with you, even though there are kind of things that are similar to that guy in the sonnets, it's also a pretty vaguely generic, just young boy, right? Like, I don't know if it's really that strong of a case that has to be the Earl of Southampton. You know what I mean? Like,
Yes.
I don't know. This idea that this guy that he didn't write the sonnets, I'm a little skeptical of. With that said, this is kind of the point too. Like, what is the evidence that the Bard of Avon did write the sonnets? I mean, not as much as you think, right? Like, so it could have been De Vere. I'm not saying it wasn't either. I just don't think like Unz, this is the way Unz talks. He like will mention an objection, go, yeah, I find that plausible, and then he will spend the rest of the article talking as if this is now a point that we've all agreed upon. You know what I mean?
Right.
And I'm like, wait, hold on. I didn't accept that point at all. But this is kind of off track. Article overall is very good and worth reading. If you didn't link it, you should. So I will say, like, he makes this point. If Shakespeare was widely known as merely being a pen name used by Oxford or someone else, this idea of people would say that contemporaneous, another emphasized by those who challenge the orthodox Shakespeare narrative, sorry, I'll restart the paragraph, was that some contemporaneous critics had implied that the great playwright had unfairly taken credit for work that was not his own. But if Shakespeare was widely known as merely being a pen name used by Oxford or someone else, this seemed to make little sense. Would anyone have accused Mark Twain of falsely taking credit for the works written by Samuel Clemens? However, if most or nearly all of the texts of the popular plays had been produced many years earlier by North and someone operating under the pen name of Shakespeare and instead become publicly identified with them and lauded as their author, such criticism would be far more understandable. So, like, imagine 500 years from now, we know that Mark Twain was an incredible author, but we don't know it's Samuel Clemens. So we go, hey, wait a minute, who is Mark Twain? Well, we search in the records and we figure out, oh, wait a minute, there was like this guy, let's say he was a lawyer who worked in, Missouri. I don't know, I'm making stuff up, but right, a lawyer who worked in Missouri. His name is Mark Twain. He spells it with an E, but maybe that was just the pen name he used. He used it without an E, right? And hey, he does have a couple of published short stories. So we don't actually have them, but he has there's a record of them existing at this point. So we even have missing Mark Twain works, right? There you go. We found our guy. Meanwhile, it's actually Samuel Clemens, and everybody at the time knew it was Samuel Clemens. We just forgot. So Unz ends the theory by going that he thinks that there were three Shakespeares. There was Thomas North, the man ignored by history, but who wrote most of the text of the plays, the individual behind the name, who was probably Edward de Vere, Earl of Oxford, according to Unz, by the way, and the affluent businessman, Mr. Shakespeare of Stratford upon Avon, who spent the last several centuries misidentified as the genius of English literature and history's greatest playwright. So, this is Unz's theory. I propose a different theory that also accords with all the facts. I think that it is, so all of the stuff about the Bard from Avon not being Shakespeare is only suggestive. It's not conclusive. Like the fact that his family was illiterate doesn't really mean that much, right? Hey, Caitlin is here. Hi, Caitlin. Anyway, the fact that his family is illiterate really doesn't mean that much. Like maybe he was out all the time. Maybe they just didn't find it very valuable to get an education, right? Because he was traveling a lot, and he just said, "Yeah, I'll take care of you. We're doing fine. Yeah, don't worry about it." Or maybe it was the opposite. Maybe they weren't doing that great because sure he was a merchant and an actor, but like they weren't like super rich. So maybe they said, "Don't worry about school, just work." Right? Who knows?
Right.
There could have been a couple of things. School wasn't valued in the same way back then as it is now. Um, the misspelling of his name is suggestive, but it's not conclusive. One theory that would easily account for that is simply that a newspaper misspelled the name when he published his first play, and then he ran with it. I mean, that's what I would do if I were in that situation. Is that proof? Does that disprove it? Is it still a point of evidence against it? Sure, it's a point of evidence, but it's far from a conclusive point of evidence. Okay, so we know he was an actor. We know he was roughly from the right time period, right? So what is his connection to all of this? I propose an alternate theory. I think that he was a businessman, right? And he was an actor, so he was involved in drama. North was not interested in publishing his plays, as we mentioned. Like he did publish some of them, but they didn't get huge popular, and drama was often not published. So he said, "Hey, I'm an actor and not a nobleman, so I can put it under my name. How about I buy your plays and then you approach Edward de Vere, who's the Earl of Oxford, have been your collaborator on other stuff, hence the other names with the name Shakespeare under it, right? The other plays with the name Shakespeare under it, and go, hey, I have a proposition for you. I'm going to buy these plays from North. Why don't you edit them a bit and then we'll publish them under my name?" And De Vere, who didn't want, who would not have wanted to publish things under his name, would have said, "Sure, great." And North would have said, "Sure, great. I don't care, right? Like I've already published my stuff and you're paying for them." And then it's all published under the name William Shakespeare. And maybe that early play, the one without De Vere, perhaps that happened before the bard from Avon, Shakespeare, met De Vere or talked to De Vere, right? Like maybe it was an early play that Shakespeare either published unedited or edited himself lightly, right? And it's considered like good because it was North, and North is the originator of a lot of the stuff, but not quite as good and not as conclusive, right? Or maybe North published it and simply didn't use, and Shakespeare wasn't involved, as was suggested by Unz. That's also very, very possible, right? And then we go, wait a minute, why is this so similar to Shakespeare's later stuff? Well, because North is the originator of a lot of it. I think this is a very elegant theory. If you buy the arguments that need to be an aristocrat that wrote the sonnets, which, by the way, I'm not convinced by, but are at least suggestive, then it would make sense why he would publish it under the name Shakespeare, right? If he was collaborating with William Shakespeare and William Shakespeare had made a deal with him to publish the stories, then if he didn't want to let out that he was a homosexual or something, right? Then you simply use the pen name that you used when you were a playwright, right? Why not? Or maybe we're overthinking this. Maybe North wrote the sonnets. That's very possible.
It is.
I mean, what if Shakespeare just bought because we all know, like, the reason that the sonnet era, quote unquote, happened is that the play kit in the theaters shut down for a while, right? Given that, what if Shakespeare wanted to keep publishing stuff? So he went to North and said, "Hey, I'll give you some money for a group of sonnets," and then he published them. So what's your thoughts on all of this? Like, what do you think of the methodology? What do you think of the conclusion? Because I find the conclusion that's North to be plausible. I am not 100% convinced, only because I haven't looked into the methodology yet myself. But if the methodology is convincing, I have no problem saying that North is the original author of a lot of these plays.
Yeah, like so like the information that you presented to me is reasonable. My main arguments against it is I simply don't care who wrote Shakespeare's plays. Shakespeare's plays being written by Shakespeare works. It doesn't make me richer or poorer for Lord to have written them, or what was the other guy's name? De Vere.
De Vere, yeah. Oxford, you
Uh,
could call him.
sure. Oxford, we'll say. Uh, and it doesn't change my life a bit, for have Devere to edit them, But the key is, for the information provided, what does it look like? Well, I mean, the Lord North thing sounds good to me. Uh, it's he would have plenty of time to do it. The time period that these things happened in was notoriously peaceful if you weren't in the British Navy or a colonist, and I mean peaceful in quotes. There's like gradients of peace. People might look at things like, oh wow, we went through the riots and this and the plague. Oh, how not peaceful it is. But in reality, we're not going through a civil war. There were no major wars. Even the Ukraine war is not really a major war unless we make it so. So it's actually, we're enjoying a decent amount of peace, uh, probably too much peace. So it's like one of those things where it's like, yeah, there's plenty of time to make art. Lord North doesn't have to do too much. It sounds like, if this dude's mooning over boys and whatnot, and it tracks also for character. One of the things that attracts homosexuals to theater is that it's kind of a taking them out of their own skin approach. They get to live a different life, either a fantasy or a surcease of existence, a sort of sublimation of the will to somebody else who is either more or less upright, able to deny or to accept the feelings that's within them. The homosexual, it understands his disorder. Therefore, the homosexual acts on that disorder, either to break himself of it or live in shame or whatever emotion keeps him from, doing it, or he acts on it, which is what we generally see today every day. You scroll down Twitter or something, and then you see another post about surrogacy, and you just don't want to see it. You don't want to see it. So it's like that. Like, sure, okay, I see where it is, where it comes from. Theater kids all the way down, just like turtles. Uh, you know, the how do I want to put it? We've talked. I think did we mention we've mentioned our Hamlet, right?
Yes, I briefly mentioned it.
Yes. So when it comes to writing, I know there's plenty of authors around our circles. We talk to a lot of authors. Uh, uh, Hold on, I can think it through. I'm sorry, I haven't had a nap today, so I'm even like wonky than usual. Uh, when I mentioned this earlier when I talked about where the werewolf story, right? I'm not always writing something completely new. When I write something completely new, when I'm trying to break new ground, which is never new ground, what I mean by new is that I don't have a specific story that I'm referencing or song or other piece of media that I'm referencing when I'm writing this story, right? It's not that it's literally a new piece of existence, it's that I am not directly taking from anything else. I wrote a part of the short story I finished. There's a moment where a character discusses with, the Jesus allegory lion about the idea of, eating and being full and the return of Jesus Christ, where essentially sin is no more. And the animal, who is conversant but not quite conversant like a Narnian animal would, doesn't quite sin like we would sin. Like, there's actually, sort of like a return to the Edenic covenant, right? So it's like it can't think like a human would, Lord, forgive me my sins. Instead, it has to think in animal terms. And one of the most fundamental experiences of the animal is its hunger, right? So, but what story am I referencing? I don't know. I don't know if there's a single story I'm referencing. I'm making a allegory to biblical ideas. In the end, he's reassured that someday the lion will lie down with the lamb. I think if you were an animal, that would be very comforting. Again, What am I referencing? Well, I'm just talking about the Bible. There's no like other media there. So the idea that I need to have the character who has acted rashly and has these different troubles as these stories go, feel some sort of guilt about, being an animal, having to kill and eat, even when it's provided to him by God, which of course the Bible says it is. You know, it's different and more than just a character going, and then I got the babe, the end, or and then I melancholily strolled out into the field. But if you look at Shakespeare's plays, a Lord Norse plays, whatever, how much of it is actually true new? Right? Not even referencing like what I discussed, right? A biblical idea that I'm discussing through these characters, where I want to make a deeper point. How much of it is something that is ex nihilo? Well, I would actually say probably very little. Julius Caesar could be taken from Plutarch's Lives fairly easily, as well as other sources which we know they had. Plutarch's Lives was distributed throughout the colonies, and most American families had that along with a Bible. Then you had things like, at least the literate ones, I should say. Uh, then you had things like Julius Caesar. We talked about Hamlet. Hamlet. There's the story of Hamlet that exists. While it would take effort to rewrite Hamlet into something entertaining and whatnot, the most of the effort is not into actually writing a new story. It's to take the existing pieces and create something that your target audience is going to enjoy. Romeo and Juliet, that's comedy dell'arte. There were probably 50 different Romeo and Juliets running around that have been completely forgotten. And I don't mean that in an exaggerated way, maybe a little hyperbole, but I mean it literally that there were a ton of potential remixes of Romeo and Juliet running around at that time. uh, Macbeth, classic Scottish lord murdered people and going around being crazy. That happened in real life. I went to Scotland and they talked about how XYZ Scottish lord murdered this one, and it was just a chain of murders. It's not that difficult to come up with another murderous and ambitious Scottish lord who seeks to overthrow his master. Like going through these things, I don't want to denigrate them, right? I'm not saying they're terrible. I'm still saying they're very good. But I am saying that, things like timing, how much he's writing, who he's writing for. So like the average English person, I would actually say that even the most illiterate peasant could understand more references that weren't like just dog crap than our literate peasants, quote unquote literate peasants today who only watch Marvel slop. There was kind of just a higher breed. Sure, they liked a fart joke, but like quite frankly, I've barely seen any fart jokes in Marvel. That's how low it is. Then you have what was capable of the plays. There's nothing in Shakespeare's plays that are impossible for anyone to do anything about. There's nothing that references something that he wouldn't know. There's nothing that breaks new ground technologically. There's all kinds of things that they could have done that I've seen in more modern plays that he just doesn't do. So it's like to me, excuse me, I'm sorry, excuse me. So to me, these things that people talk about, timing and experience and all these other little things that they go, oh, I don't know. In reality, they can all be explained. Some of the plays are common knowledge English history that some of their relatives, like their grandparents, were probably around for. Um, I think, yeah, like there hadn't been enough time. Like I'm sure some people who were young during Richard the Third's rule were still around. Plus, there were plenty of things to talk about, like the princes. Excuse me. The princes in the tower are an eternal conspiracy theory that people talk about. I watched documentaries about them as a child. I had them mentioned in old books that I had. It's an eternal thing that shows up. So to me, it's all like nothing in Shakespeare's plays is unreasonable. Nothing that like I know it's unreasonable in the sense of like, yeah, of course it's not unreasonable. He produced the plays. I mean it in an academic sense, right? The arguments against the plays being written, or it's more than our three players will say, just fall flat because it's not necessary. Like I was always satisfied with Shakespeare doing it because of several reasons that I'm going to lay out. Sorry for the cough, by the way, guys. Was reasonable for several reasons that I'm going to lay out here. First, Shakespeare himself is not required to be literate to write the plays. Yes, in the most pedantic sense, Shakespeare has to be literate to literally write the plays with his own hand. Pardon. However, scribes were all over the place. He could have hired a scribe. He was working in business. So, in other words, he was just signing contracts nobody read to him that he couldn't read. That's ridiculous. That's absurd. He had plenty of opportunities to have scribes, to have workers with him that were literate to the extreme, even if he was not himself literate. And I mean loyal workers, not dumb workers. And I'm not saying this to counter Anthony, by the way. I'm saying this in the sense of uh, if we're going to be conspiracy theories about, I like the Lord North as writer. Shakespeare bought them, and De Vere, Oxford edited them. Like that's fine. That's perfectly cromulent. Makes a certain it makes a lot of sense. But like, secondly, excuse me, as Shakespeare was a experienced playwright and actor, uh, there's no reason that he wouldn't have the knowledge necessary to create an entertaining play with or without being literate. In fact, there's a great way to edit your plays. You're acting them out, somebody says something, and you're like, oh, I don't like that. Let's change it. Some of them he clearly, like I've mentioned before, Winter's Tale, I don't like it. I don't care to watch it. It's boring to me. Some of them he clearly just, left as they were and moved on to something better. It's easy to document them, set them down, right? Okay, we're going to do this. We're going to have this speech I've written with De Vere, or I've, sort of played out with this because I know what I want. I write my stories in my head. You're saying that a playwright can't write the plays in his head. It's ridiculous. Sure, the leading actor is too stupid to remember more than his lines. But we're not talking about leading actors. We're talking about the head of you know, we're talking about the main force behind the play company. Second, the next point is that there's no reason that Shakespeare wouldn't know all the history events that took place around him. Uh, Richard III, Julius Caesar, Richard II, all the Henrys. Uh, uh, there was plenty of Greek myth around to write Midsummer Night's Dream. There's plenty to write. What's the one with Caliban in it? The Tempest. Yeah, the Tempest. Thank you. Uh, so it's frustrating to me to hear, oh well, he wouldn't have done this or he wouldn't have done that. Well, actually, that's not actually an argument. Yeah, sure. For some things like the sonnets, and I'm not even talking about the sonnets, by the way. I'm just talking about the plays. Um, for the plays, like point out something that a tradesman couldn't know or couldn't be told. I don't think there is anything. Partially because they're plays and they're works of fiction, even if they're based on real events, but also because it's I'm trying to think plays on real events, but also because the goal is to entertain. Shakespeare didn't make these choices out of a vacuum, right? He wasn't doing it for the art. He had a product to sell, and he wanted to sell it to the masses. So, in other words, he would make changes and choices either from buying it from Lord North, or from acting him out and writing it himself. That would be the most entertaining points. At certain points, you could tell, so, for example, in Macbeth, you could tell when the audience is getting bored. I know I'm ranting, but I'm nearly done. I swear, maybe. In Macbeth, there's a scene where a gatekeeper shows up, and all he does is make sexual innuendo for like 10 lines, you know, to the king or whatever it is. I can't remember the scene offhand. So, you know, like, why is that in there? Would Lord North put that in there? Oh yeah, he would because of this. No, I think, and this is just a personal theory, that Shakespeare knew it was getting a bit dry, so he threw this in to get the crowd riled back up, and get the interest back in. Like, there's a thousand little tricks to do it. I throw little humorous anecdotes. Like, I literally went through the short story I wrote to finish today, and I said, this part's a little dry. I'm going to add a quip here, a detective saying, because it's a detective cat having detective cat adventures. So he's going to say something a little bit, demeaning and funny here, because he's a jerk cat. And it's going to keep things moving along. He's going to doubt a character's intelligence. He doesn't know if the character's smart or not. So it's like there's an assumption that Shakespeare did it for the art and the joy of the art alone, and that is completely untenable from what we know of the character of the man and from the events surrounding his life. The dude was obsessed with theater. He could have made a lot more money, short stacking the South Sea bubble or whatever. But instead, he did plays, and he was successful enough to be known for it, and honored for it. Therefore, even though he was in it for the love of the game and the money that got from it, we can say that he shot for that higher level. But but certain arguments that, like, oh, Shakespeare was crap, or oh, it's crap because he wasn't the real writer, or certain things, like whatever the source of the work, it doesn't actually change the events of the life or the value that they have as pieces. Fundamentally, under the theory that Anthony put out, which is a very good theory, in the end, Shakespeare bought the plays, so they're still Shakespeare's plays. Uh, you know, it just comes full circle. It's all Shakespeare's all the way down. Anthony and Shakespeare's. All the world's a stage, Anthony. It's a stage.
See, though, when you ask the question of, like, who wrote Shakespeare's plays, you're not asking who is the guy who legally owned them. That's like saying, and everybody knows that Star Wars was a Disney property. Like, no, it was a George Lucas creation, right? Similarly, we want to know, like, I'm not accusing Shakespeare or De Vere of anything, because I don't think that plagiarism is a plausible hypothesis at all.
Absolutely not.
Especially from the Bard from Avon, because how could a commoner plagiarize a nobleman with zero consequences for decades? Like, it's utterly implausible.
And by the way, he played for royalty. There was no way in hell that Lord North, wasn't aware of Shakespeare's actions.
North himself wasn't royalty. North had family that was royalty, though. So the point stands.
No, Right. But what I mean is that, you don't get command performances to royalty without an incredible amount of infamy.
Yeah,
Is what I'm trying to
exactly.
say.
Exactly. It doesn't make any sense. Um
Yeah.
so I don't
I
hold the
also
plagiarism theory to be plausible at all. Therefore, I think
but
that I think one of two things is true. I think either the
hold
yes.
on. Sorry, just to put the just to talk about plagiarism for a second. We are really sensitive about plagiarism because we can copy and paste things. In reality, most of humanity, as long as you filed off the serial numbers and changed, a few things here and there, they would have been like, yeah, sure, it's similar enough, but whatever. I don't care. I'm an illiterate peasant in Germany, or I'm a nobleman who didn't write them. Like it's like there's a bit of sensitivity about plagiarism, but like they let certain characters just make up like history whole cloth and treated them like serious academics. Like in reality, like I think it's Alexander Pope, who basically made up things uh, because he wanted them to be true and he thought it was reasonable for the events that he was writing about. Like it's like they were letting that happen and treating him like serious until we decided to check his sources, which were nonsense. Uh, so it's like we're sensitive to plagiarism in ways that people just weren't. And I don't know whether it's because we have access to all the information or what, but it's like they went at like they have huge exposés on the internet. Oh, this YouTuber plagiarized this YouTuber plagiarized that, and then it's just like a little too close to the source article. Give me a break. Give me a break. I don't care. Sorry, keep going. Keep going.
No, yeah, I agree with you, and I will say too that to be fair, in the modern day, plagiarism is more of a concern with copy paste and with AI. With that said, a lot of like the
Yeah,
plagiarism panic was created by Disney, who were jealously
yeah.
guarding their products and kept extending the copyright life of things. But whatever, uh, that's a whole discussion for another day that we will probably have. By the way, but
It drives me crazy that people treat like Disney seriously for copyright hoarding, or like there's like YouTubers like H Bomber guy, like how many sex scandals can a person have before you stop taking him
I
seriously?
didn't know we had sex
Uh,
scandals. Interesting.
didn't he? I know he's a pervert. I could have sworn I heard an accusation somewhere or other. And if there isn't one, that's entirely surprising based on the way he acts.
Yeah, but yeah, it's not something I've heard, but I'd have to look into it more. Whatever. That's neither here nor there at the moment. So yeah, I'm trying to think it over.
Yeah.
So my point here is that there's a lot of stuff I want to why I find the topic so interesting because you're right in what makes this discussable in a way is that this is really small potatoes. In the end, the consequences are some academics will be mildly embarrassed that they were wrong, right? Um,
Dead academics.
yeah, well, modern epidemic, like 94%, according to this article, at least the last poll of academics think that the writer of the plays is the bard from Avon. Um, and I would need, like I said, I would need to see the methodology, but I will say if the methodology of North shakes out, then the if then proposition is if the methodology is good, then I think it's probably correct because the claim being made is pretty like cut and dry, right? So yeah, I think North, and I think it like either the bard from Avon was the businessman who hired DeVere, or DeVere used Shakespeare as a pen name. I find both of those plausible. I find the businessman idea to be a little bit more plausible because it accounts for things like Ben Jonson identifying him as the creator, right? Like,
Right.
and it explains
I would.
how he was misidentified for such a long time because it is like as much as the Mark Twain thing is a neat thing to say, like if you think about it, what would it take for us to completely lose that Samuel Clemens was Mark Twain? It's hard for me to imagine. even 100 years from now.
Because there's media referencing it.
Yeah. And which is exactly the case, like, at the time. There wasn't a lot of media referencing it, I will grant you, but there was some. So, with that said, if the bard from Avon was not involved at all and it was just De Vere, that wouldn't terribly shock me. But I think that my way is a little bit more parsimonious of all of the evidence. It takes that into account because we know he was a businessman.
Yeah.
We know he was an actor. We know that the nobleman, like, that drama was kind of considered gauche for noblemen, right? But it wouldn't have been considered gauche for Shakespeare, who was not for the bard from Avon, who was not a nobleman, right? So these things sort of add up. But we're in the speculative territory. What would not be speculative is if what these claims about North are true. And that's where you go, like, okay, then we're going to need to come to a conclusion one way or another that North might have been the original writer of the plays. Which is fine, and I don't have a problem with that. What I'm interested in with this, though, is that what it tells us about, like, research methodology and what we know about the past. So I was having a conversation with a friend of the channel, fellow Pinkerton's ghost author, and good friend of mine, David Hallquist. Hi, David, if you ever listen to this. David was saying that he had some concerns with this sort of, like, methodology because it seemed too similar to him to what the left does with, like, unpersoning people and trying to get rid of the achievements of our ancestors by positing that someone else did it. I don't think that this is comparable for a variety of reasons. For one thing, we're not replacing Shakespeare with, like, a transsexual black man who was secretly infiltrating society, right? Nor are we decanonizing Shakespeare's literature. All we're doing is saying that actually the guy that we thought was the bard, well, we were wrong. It's a different white British guy. Like, okay. I mean, I guess if you want to say that there's some loss here, it's that Shakespeare wasn't a nobleman, and however, neither was North. North wasn't a nobleman. North had relatives who were noblemen, who worked in the court of Elizabeth. Not even were noblemen, but he was not a nobleman. So you're not even getting that. So this doesn't really do any of that. Like, it's honestly just a historical, discussion. Like, there's no stakes to it as far as I could tell, right? So I don't think it's of the same level. I also agree, though. He made the point, like, we've got to be careful because a lot of the article was speculation, not proof. Right about this, and I agree with it. And it's my big problem with Unz a lot of the time, like I said earlier. If you read the article, there's a lot of, so he made this point. I found it plausible. And then later in the article, it's just like, well, we all agree about this point, right? It's fact. So we all just assume, like, it's definitely not the guy from Avon, which I'm like, wait, hold on. I didn't know we were all agreeing about this because some guy said, hey, it seems unlikely. Like, that's it. That's your, but the North thing I don't consider. However, what this is kind of helpful when looking at is, like, a lot of what the mainstream public thinks about historical methodology and, like, research methodology is very wrong. For example, if you hear the scholarly consensus is that the guy from Avon, William Shakespeare, is the William Shakespeare who wrote the plays. That would tell you, like, almost all scholars agree. Someone were to tell you this. It's like I was saying with Rotten Tomatoes earlier. That might be true, but it doesn't tell you anything about the actual strength of the evidence. It's like saying that 90% of people gave this movie a 6 out of 10, right? 90% of scholars agree that there is a 60% chance that this guy is Shakespeare. And in truth, when you actually look at the weight of the individual evidence pointing to the guy from Avon as being Shakespeare, it's not as strong as you think. And there is very little contemporary evidence from the time period. We don't even, we almost lost most of Shakespeare's plays. The discovery of the first folio was borderline miraculous, right? Like, it was a borderline miraculous discovery that gave us almost the entirety of Shakespeare's corpus. And it is almost pure coincidence that we even have it. So this idea that, oh, all of this evidence points to the guy from Avon, like, sure, the majority of the evidence did, at least for a while, the North thing might change it, but at least for a while did point to the guy from Avon being Shakespeare, but it wasn't actually that much evidence. Like, there just wasn't that much of it. And people act as if, oh, but we should have so much, or we act like there's so much evidence because there's a scholarly consensus. You see this all the time, and it gets to be very misleading. For example, you talk to anyone days, I just read an article on this, was very interesting, about chess, the origins of chess. You ask anyone, where does chess come from, who's done any bit of studying on the topic, they will tell you it originated in India from a game called Chaturanga. And they are correct, insofar as that is what the scholarship seems to point to now. It's what most scholars would agree with. And not only that, I would even go a step further and say most scholars are correct to say, yes, it is currently, based on the evidence we have at the moment, more likely than not, or more likely than any other choice, that chess originated in India, right? The problem is when you actually look at the individual pieces of evidence pointing to India, there isn't actually that much. There's just marginally more in some ways than for the other two popular options, which is China and Persia. Truthfully, the more accurate thing to say, though less pithy and less understandable, I think, by normies or non-scholars, is based on the evidence we currently have, chess is most likely to have originated in India, but it also easily could have originated from Persia or China, and new evidence can swing what we believe. Now, that's not pithy. That's not easy to understand, but it's more accurate. It's more accurate to the data. Like, the truth is that even though it's most likely, under what we currently know, that chess originated in India, we don't actually know this for sure. The data that we have is not very high, and this needs to be taken into account when we talk about, like, scholarly consensus. It's especially important when we talk about biblical criticism, and it's something that I've been kind of leaning on. Like, the Shakespeare thing should really tell us a lot about, like, how we need to look at the weight of evidence. Because this idea that all of this evidence points to the bard from Avon, well, the truth is that all of the evidence, or most of the evidence, at least the concrete, hard evidence, until the discovery of the North documents, which changes things, but leaving that aside, since it's new and is like up until the North discovery, the hard evidence did point to the bard from Avon being Shakespeare. It's just that there wasn't that much of it, and it wasn't really particularly strong. I'm not saying the scholars were wrong in attributing the plays to the bard from Avon. What I'm saying is that we need to be a lot more humble about what we're claiming is and isn't a fact. I mean, it goes when you talk about Exodus, it's a great example, right, of the thing that we're talking about. What is the evidence that Exodus actually happened? Well, the strongest evidence we have for Exodus is that there's a fucking book written about it by a group of people who were involved in it, which, like, is actually a really strong piece of evidence, but funnily enough, doesn't really come up that often. Like, however, if you actually go into, like, linguistic analysis of the book of Exodus, you see that the language used, the number of Egyptian loan words, and the names and things like that, like, it all points very strongly to Exodus actually having some form of historical basis to it. But it's true, it's not conclusive. So where's the archaeological evidence for Exodus? There isn't any. Right? Like, this is well known. This sounds damning, right? There is no, and we could just say it. Let's just say it outright. We have no archaeological evidence that the Exodus happened, or very, 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 very little, right? Virtually none. I think there might be, like, one very vague reference to Israel in like some Egyptian monument somewhere. That's it. That's all we have. So,
yes, that's true.
yes.
It was deliberately destroyed, as far as we can tell. Like, what can be done?
Mhm.
Oh, I guess it didn't
Yeah.
happen because the Egyptians destroyed all the
So
evidence.
that's, as far as I am aware, like that's it. It's one very, very vague reference to like Israel or Israelites. Which, by the way, you might go, "Oh, Israel wasn't a country yet," right? But Israel, the person, had already existed. So that's let's just keep that in mind, right? Israel is Jacob. Uh, the tribes were descended from him, so they might have already been calling themselves Israelites, or the Egyptians might have been calling them that. So keep that in mind for a moment. But okay, we don't have any evidence, and I will concede this point. There is zero archaeological evidence that the Exodus happened. But this is the misleading thing about this. The Exodus took place like what, 6,000 fucking years ago? Like, if we found any archaeological evidence for the Exodus, it would frankly be astonishing. Like, that would be the find of, I don't even want to say the century. That would be one of the greatest archaeological finds in all of human history. Right.
Anthony, it happened over 3,000 years ago, but not more than 4,000 years
Between 3
ago.
and 4.
Come
Thank you.
on.
Still insane.
Yeah.
But
Come on, Anthony. It's not 6.
silly me.
That's some Bishop Unger talk.
Yes. Silly me. 3 to 4. I happen to agree. I watched some videos on it. I happen to agree that it's funny because there was like a period of time. It almost looks like the Midwit meme where Ramses II was the most popular choice for the Exodus pharaoh, and then there was like a period where they go, no, it probably wasn't Ramses. It might have been Thutmose II, or yeah. And then like the far end of the meme is like, actually, it probably was Ramses II. So I'm kind of in the I'm in the currently in the Ramses II camp. There's a lot of factors that add up. That Ramses the Great was in fact the Exodus pharaoh, but either way, like, so let's say Ramses is the Exodus pharaoh. Either way, like if we were to find some evidence from over from like 1,000 years before the birth of Christ, that there was an exodus of a small group of slaves from Egypt into the desert, and the death of a group of noblemen's children in the capital city, like that would be utterly astonishing archaeolocal evidence. Everybody goes, "Oh, have they ever found a chariot wheel in the Red Sea?" Well, no, water dissolves things. Like, for one thing, it would be remarkable if we found something from the Exodus which, by the way, the Reed Sea, really, not the Red Sea, but whatever.
No, it was the Red Sea. You're being the midwit in the
No,
midwit meme, Anthony.
No, I'm gonna say the Reed Sea. My understanding of this is that it was simply a mistranslation.
No.
Like, it's not even a conspiracy or a thing.
It was the Red Sea.
Mm,
It was the Red Sea, Anthony.
I think it was the Reed Sea. I don't know. I don't care.
Look,
I literally.
okay, hold on.
This is such a non-point to me. Like, if it was the Red Sea, I don't care.
Entirely important. Entirely
It's not important.
because it says that they walked on dry land. It doesn't matter whether it was Red Sea or Reed Sea or whatever. In reality, they walked on dry land.
Yes.
Therefore, it is equally possible to be them. However, all the years, the hundreds and hundreds of years of biblical scholarship, only now people are bringing up the Reed Sea thing.
Oh, yeah. Well,
you mean to tell me that people who believe that they would go to hell if they mistranslate a single syllable, made such a huge difference?
I don't know, man. Even like the Christian scholars that I follow tend to say it's probably the Reed Sea, but
yeah,
I also Christian don't care.
Scholars, okay, fine. If you don't care, I'm not going to fight it. But it's like this, right? Is this connected to what we're talking about?
Oh, it is. Yeah, you are right. Like, I will say that. My point is only like The reason that I don't care is because we're talking about a miracle where water was parted and they walked across. They could have named any body of water, and as far as I'm concerned, the miracle is equally miraculous. I have seen people be very uncomfortable, like, oh, isn't the Reed Sea smaller than the Red Sea? But to me, that's like, honestly, anytime a body of water parts, I think it's pretty impressive. So I don't know, man. Like,
I'm not questioning it if I see
yeah,
it.
like, oh, it's a small body of water. Well, I've never seen any body of water part. So, uh, in half, so that a group of people could
I
walk
didn't.
through.
I'm not like, it's one of those things where it's like, I know people say it, but at the same time, it's like, I don't like. It's like, okay, so we know it existed back then, right? Well, it exists now. That doesn't mean anything. What about back then? Like, it's that sort of thing. Like, there's multiple holes to the argument. In fact, I'm going to parallel it right now. So, if you're going to convince me about the Reed Sea, there's several things that I would like to know. I would like to know whether the geography was commensurably the same. And I have multiple reasons as to why I have problems with it being the same without the scientific proof shown me. One, coastlines change over time, erosion, natural changes. Swamps have appeared due to several causes. For example, things like new aqueducts being formed, dams. Egypt had dams. Where's that water going? I don't know. They had a whole lot of shipping in that area. You mean to tell me that, which may have reached all the way to India, which I believe it did, in fact. You're telling me that they willingly left prime shipping area to, be a swamp, during the period of their greatest pharaoh, who was doing all kinds of crazy building projects? That's pretty wild. Secondly, no, or not secondly, the next one. Okay, so it says in the Bible that Israel went out to the desert to pray. They had a specific going to, and that they were, sort of coming back from, going to and coming back for some of the times when they went out. It is reasonable for them to have the same pathway. If it's going out into the desert, guess what? A swamp isn't desert. Having a Reed Sea isn't desert. Guess what's bordered by deserts? The Red Sea. What's more, people mistake different parts of the Red Sea for things like, not actually a sea. But in reality, there's plenty of space for them to reach Mount Sinai without having to go crazy out of their way to do it. Lastly, uh, there's my argument about the scholars. Why in the world did every scholar up until now, for some reason, and by the way, like, I know I rag on Catholics, like, going on off on the church fathers sometimes, oh, did they, like, oh, you're taking this, to be gospel or something, 200 years from the apostles. I don't fucking know what I'm saying. Excuse me. But in reality, uh, unless a scholar, I'm a not pure sola scriptura, but I'm pretty close. If a scholar doesn't quote verses in context, like, I don't give a crap what they're saying. They could be barking like a dog and backing that up with scripture, and I'd say, okay, yeah, that makes a little bit of sense. Because that's what the standard of proof is. If scripture has been wrong for 2,000 years longer, because the Israelites reference it as the Red Sea, Moses wrote it down as the Red Sea, why in the world are we changing the story now to something less impressive when, one, we have an infinite God, two, that God decided to preserve it in a completely different way than what we're translating it today, three, some of the worst translators and people are promoting it. If I don't, I don't see people who I respect, promoting it. I haven't heard David Jeremiah. I never heard Ravi Zachariah promote this. Maybe they have, and I just missed it every time they talked about it. But, like, I've heard it from the Pop, not from the actual men doing the holy work of seeking out God and bringing forth further knowledge into this world through the study of Scripture. You wouldn't think that, like with the Catholic's history of ecstatic visions, that a monk would be struck by lightning and God goes, you misspelled that. Again, these people, had a bit of a works-based salvation. They often believed it very clearly when Jesus said, not one jot or tittle would pass away from the earth. They believed that in a very literal sense. If they made a mistake, they burned it. The Jews were no less stringent, and they had a writing system. Moses was was one of the most well-educated men of his times. The second sons, especially those not in royal line, went into the priesthood, and they knew how to write. I can go on and on about this stuff, but to me, it's like, looking at who's promoting it. Why is it suddenly changed? For some of the stuff like Shakespeare, since there's a gap in possession of the folios, it makes a certain amount of sense. What's more, why in the world would Shakespeare promote Lord North if the whole thing is that he bought them and he paid the editor to edit them? If it is, if Oxford is indeed the editor. Well, we don't have that problem with the Bible. We know where every book of the Bible has been. We have scraps of paper within years, within lifetimes of the Gospels and of the letters to Paul. And by the way, there's absolutely no reason why the Gospels should have survived this long of the original paperwork. And I'll explain why. And that's because they were used. They were documents that were used and lovingly used constantly. What's more, several libraries, whether by Roman or Muslim or just, rioters, Christian or otherwise, burned down several libraries that would have had them. It is entirely reasonable for the original documents to disappear. Uh, but we have documents within, lifetimes of the people doing it. They all translated the same way. So in other words, gaps of information that are present in the Shakespeare event are not, I'm arguing for the Reed C a little too hard, hold on, but they're not present in the Bible. If the Bible had gaps as like what we're seeing with Shakespeare, we would have a deep problem. But instead, we have plenty of reason to believe the Bible as it is. So it's like one of those things where uh hold on, I can get there. And so it's one of those things that while we can look at the who and where and how and why, if we look at the facts on the ground, if we look at the explicit events that went on with the various characters, with the events in their lives, we can see that some theories are entirely possible. The Lord North Shakespeare Oxford theory, especially in a more positive route and not a plagiaristic route, is in fact cromulent. It makes sense. Lord North probably needed the money. Shakespeare was happy to pay the money. Shakespeare was also happy to get his hands on some really good plays, even some of the wackier ones like The Tempest. It's got kind of the opposite problem to the Reed C, where there are certain things in the Reed C that don't make sense. For example, again, why did God let the mistranslation happen all the time? Why was it a lesser miracle to do that? They were right there. They could have walked across the Red Sea. Why did Moses go, yeah, they'll never mistake this for that? When in actuality, this dude would, with the most monkey-like strength that's ever been recorded in the Bible, fling tablets when Israel disobeys him, and tragically smashed a rock when when the Lord said just to tap it. Um, you know, he was a man of a temper. If he was mistaken, he killed people over, if people mistook his words, he didn't go, oh, you didn't know. No, he made sure that they knew it. So when he punished them, they knew what they were being punished for. So it's like there's different standards to the mechanics for different changes in, say, like a biblical narrative versus a historical narrative are completely different. Uh, Sorry, they're not completely different, but they're different enough that certain things can be relied on for the Bible. For example, God's intervention to preserve the Bible, that cannot be relied on to history, because, quite frankly, even though I'm sure there's a certain amount of care that God has for all of us, I don't think God particularly cares who we think wrote Shakespeare's plays, as long as we're not being sinful about it. However, you can be sinful about it. You know what I mean? And I don't mean this to denigrate the discussion we're having. I mean it. Excuse me. I mean it in the sense of scholars who are trying to either use it as a gotcha or to make a name or any number of things that they could be doing. Use it for. It's in the end, I'm still going to go to Shakespeare in the Park if it's a play I want to see, and so should everyone else. No matter how liberal the area is. Um, it's valuable to the soul to consume good art, and that consummation of good art doesn't change based on the existence of the author. It is a factotum that a midwit, not that I'm calling Vox or Anthony or Ron Unz a midwit in this particular instance, but if he's excuse me, but it will be used by midwits, just like midwits use, Mark Twain, also known as Samuel Clemens. Ha ha ha, Brian from Family Guy. That was a good joke. I'm absolutely, like Stewie actually treats it like, what does that add to a conversation? What are you saying? What are you talking about? This is stupid. He like, even though it's the same voice actor, the writer chastises Brian for going Mark Twain. Oh, you mean he's also known as Samuel Clemens? Like, he's just adding a factotum to an event that, quite frankly, is entirely unnecessary to be there, unpleasant to recall, and makes you hate the person who said it because it's the worst person ever. I'm done ranting. I don't even know where I was ranting towards when I began, but I'm
Sure. I mean, like, yeah, I was trying to make a larger point about biblical criticism, and you said, like, no, you thought the Reed C stuff was motivated by the same sort of people. It's not an issue. The only reason that I even repeated it was because I had heard it said by by some scholars who I actually do like, specifically,
Oh, no.
or at least who I marginally respect. But it also, to me, like, while I get the point that you're making, to me it was never an issue that I ever felt strongly about, because I'm like,
Right.
who cares which miraculous body of water got parted? It's like I've even seen people be like concerned because they go, really? Because the Reed Sea is so much smaller, and I'm like, I've never seen a fucking bathtub part. Like, what do you mean? Like, it was large enough to drown an army. Okay. Anyway,
Right.
whatever. The larger point that I was making, which got lost in the discussion, is I concede and agree that there is no archaeological evidence for the Exodus. The problem is there is almost no archaeological evidence for anything from that era. Like, archaeological evidence is vanishingly rare and difficult to find. Like, we have archaeological evidence that the pyramids were built because the pyramids still exist. And for things that were scrawled on the walls. But newsflash, if Egypt decides, hey, we're not going to talk about it, we're going to have as evidence the group of people that did talk about it. And looky here, they wrote a book. It's interesting.
And it's like, if they're going to destroy every bit of evidence that they can get their grubby hands on, they're going to destroy all the evidence. They were very good at it. They did it like every time a pharaoh changed.
And even, like, again, this is the key point here. Even if they didn't, what would you be expecting to see? Like, from this long ago, people really have no idea. Like, this is an extraordinarily long time ago. And the point here is that Shakespeare is way, way, way in the future from this point, so much further. And we don't even know with 100% certainty when his plays were performed, like, or when they were written.
Yep.
And we're talking thousands of years later. And the archaeological, like, the evidence is that scant in a time with printing presses. And you're expecting evidence of stuff recorded in, like, archaeological evidence of Exodus. No, the truth is, the evidence we have of Exodus is that there is a group of people that say it happened and wrote a book about it. Like, that's actually very strong evidence that something happened. Like, extraordinarily strong, in fact. I mean, think of what you would need to come up with to get an entire country to believe this if it didn't actually happen. You know, that's kind of crazy. Or like when you look at the Gospels, we've mentioned this before, and I talked about it with you before the show, but the Quirinius issue in Luke, this is always, and it used to be the thing that bothered me the most about like the discrepancies in the Gospels, because the truth is, I find most Gospel contradictions to be vanishingly minute, so minor and insignificant as to be like, why are we even talking about this levels of like ludicrous, right? Oh, Matthew says, blessed are the poor in spirit, but Luke said, blessed are the poor. Thank you.
I
Very
will
nice.
massacre a German town over this.
Oh
In
man, how did
1642.
are you telling me that none of the church fathers noticed this? How were we fooled for so long? Uh, you know, it's stuff like that, or like, oh, where was Jesus? You know, there's a contradiction in the birth narratives. There isn't, by the way. Um, like that's another one that I've never. It's the same sort of people who go like, oh, hey, there's a big contradiction in like Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are two different creation stories, which is bizarre to me because they're absolutely not. It's just they tell the story in a broad sense, and then they zoom in specifically on the creation of man, which was only mentioned obliquely. Like, I don't, there isn't a contradiction at all. Like, they're clearly not two different stories. It's just, hey, and then on this day, God created man. Chapter 2. So this is the specifics of how God created man. Like, what are you talking about? There's clearly no contradiction here.
Right? Like, what was he going to do? Like, walk up to Moses, as educated as he was, and he's like, listen, so there's these tiny things called atoms, right? And and actually, Moses might have an idea of atomic theory. Not like what we know as atomic theory, but he understood that everything has a smaller bit to it. And then
True,
God
but
goes, hold on, hold on.
atomic theory was considered the atheistic and materialist view of the period.
I don't know why, but when you said that, my reaction was to call it gay. So I will unpack that in
I
my
totally understand why, and you're absolutely right to.
so like, but the thing is that like, like, is he going to walk up to Moses and go, all right, so you know about atoms, right? So there's these things called strings that may or may not exist depending on what the 20th century scientific consensus is. And I blew it all up from a big bang, whose mass is unable to be properly handled without turning into a black hole that would never actually go bang, right? And Moses is just looking at him, his eyes like slowly falling apart as his brain melts, as God tries to explain to him quantum mechanics. Not that God would have a problem explaining quantum mechanics, but I don't mean to imply, I shouldn't have implied that at all. It's just a funny little thing I said. But like, he's just not going to talk about that in the Bible. Like, nobody needs quantum mechanics in the Bible. Nobody needs, God goes, so, those weird rocks that sometimes people put up in, uh, that sometimes, people dig up from the sands, and it looks like a cool, like, lizard skull thing. And he's like, yeah, those are dinosaurs. They lived 66 million years ago. what do you mean by 66 million years ago? Yeah, and there was a meteor strike. You know what a meteor strike is? They hit this place called Mexico. Well, it's going to be called Mexico in the 20th century, at the Yucatan Peninsula. That's kind of called that today, but the language is going to drift. You don't write this down, Moses. This isn't important. Like that's not what's going to happen. Like there are like contradictions, quote unquote, to the natural world that exists that are perfectly answerable by God just saying, okay, listen, this is what this is true, right? If God cannot speak a lie, he also can't, mislead people. We can misunderstand what he says, but he's not going to lie to us, right? And so if that's true, uh, then there must be truth in what the Genesis narrative is. Therefore, you can't just say, "Oh, it's fake," because it doesn't account for the dinosaurs, guys. It doesn't discuss the Great Permian dying. Therefore, it's false. It doesn't. God doesn't talk about the Big Bang or string theory. Et cetera, et cetera. Like it's hard to sort of even talk about these things because people will bring up, sort of these contradictions that you have to answer. In the end, the Bible is what we get, for our relationship to God. And while Catholics and Protestants do disagree about certain things like the Deutero canon and the importance of sola scriptura, on what gradient you're in that, quite frankly, and I've said this to just about everyone who's come across it. The Bible is sufficient for a Christian. If he's stuck in a desert island with just a Bible, his soul's not in danger. Uh, so it's like with the logic of what we're trying to talk about here, you know, the details that people bring up that academics argue over aimlessly, in the end, just sort of collapse in on themselves with a definite wet fart rather than some sort of scientific inquiry that benefits the human race. The thing that would benefit the human race is Ramsey's own truthful narrative of what happened to the Israelites and who died and what course. But he's never going to talk about it, so it doesn't matter. you know
Yeah, and the point I was trying to get at, you're absolutely right. The point I was trying to get at with the Quirinius controversy, the one to you beforehand, is that what people will often point out, and what has been pointed out to me, is that there is a contradiction in Luke's dating of the census of Quirinius with the historical record. And this has been the one contradiction in the gospel that always bothered me because, and it's in a sense, they are right because they are flat. Luke, according to the mainstream historical opinion, is simply flatly wrong in a way that cannot be easily reconciled. So various interpretations have been proposed to account for it. None of them have been very satisfying to me. That it might not have been a census like a tax census, but for some other reason, that Quirinius might have been some position besides governor, that there might have been some quirk of the language that meant that Luke actually wasn't wrong about the time period and was stating the same time. None of these are very convincing. It seems as if there is, in fact, a contradiction with the historical record. So I am going to go so far as to concede that point. But this is the big but here and the problem with this whole line of argument and this line of thing. To say that there is a contradiction in the historical record makes it sound as if we have, written documents of a census of Quirinius, many reports of a census of Quirinius, an entire list of like a whole series of documents, and go, and Luke just has it wrong. Except that we don't. As a matter of fact, the census of Quirinius is referenced in one other place, and that is Josephus. And Josephus gives a different date than Luke. So my current theory is much more elegant, in my opinion, and much simpler. I think that Josephus just got the date wrong. And we have no other reference to a census of Quirinius. Like, there's nothing else that gives us the date besides Josephus. So when we say, oh, Luke contradicts all of our historical sources, we're right. It's just that all of our historical sources are Josephus. For the record, the census supposedly is the thing that triggered the revolt of the Zealots, according to Josephus. But, like, that's it. We got two sources. We have Josephus and we have Luke. Luke dates it earlier than Josephus. Josephus dates it to 6 AD. That's like, what, 4 years off of the actual date? Besides, it's not even that far off. But, Luke does state a specific date, right? So there is a contradiction. So why are we assuming that Luke is the one who was wrong? Like, literally, we know about it because, contrary to the Gospel of Matthew, which places Jesus' birth in the time of Herod I, the Gospel of Luke correlates it with the census. Right. Well, most critical biblical scholars have acknowledged that the Gospel of Luke is erroneous. Right. Okay. Except, the only other place that we have recording this, and then they go, oh, but there's none. We don't have, the Romans didn't do this. No. Well, what that means is we don't have any records besides Luke that the Romans did this. The problem is we don't have a lot of Roman records of the time. Like, what would make you think that a bargain bin census is going to be recorded? Like, why would this be something that we would save the papers?
It's like the invasions of Arabia that the Romans did. They invaded down, they were trying to invade Yemen for a decade. Failed. They decided, we're not talking about it.
Yeah, and I'm also looking at the Wikipedia page, which obviously this should be with a grain of salt, right? Like, the Wikipedia page says that Luke dates Judas's census incited revolt as following the rebellion of Theudas, but then it says with a little note, some Christian defenders have postulated that Acts was referring to a different Theudas. I have not looked into this at all. I've never heard of this mentioned as a contradiction before. This is like the first I've seen it as I'm like quickly perusing the article. Yeah, some people have mentioned that have generally posited an earlier census took place, invoking unproven claims, like Wikipedia saying this. Yeah, but I'm still going to, like, I honestly think that the most obvious answer here is simply that we have two sources for the census: Josephus, who states that it was the origin of the revolt, and Luke, who states that the revolt was actually caused by Theudas and the census was a little bit earlier. It's not that Josephus is a generally reliable source, but he's been wrong on things before. So the thing is, though, that even if you're not assuming that Luke inspired, which obviously I think he was, right? But let's just say you can't assume that. That begs the question. Okay, even if that begs the question, Luke is also normally reliable. Just like so you have to pick between two reliable sources, right? Luke is actually known for being an incredibly careful historian who makes very specific datable claims and who archaeological evidence has backed up on a lot of very specific details. Like, for example, the shipwreck in Malta, which has been discovered before. So, given all of this, it's just so weird that we're like, oh, well, Luke must have just been wrong. Where you go, no, he wasn't. You go, oh, but the Romans didn't conduct censuses this way. Like, no, what you actually mean is we don't have any record besides Luke, who is a record, that the Romans conducted censuses like this frequently. And why would we? It's just a census. It's not historically notable at all. Like, why on earth would you expect people to save a record of a census? They go, oh, but they need to travel to their hometown. Yeah, because most people lived in their hometowns. Like, it wasn't that big of a requirement, And then one day, and if they didn't live there, they were probably not that far away. So it's like not a very stringent requirement at all. This isn't something that would have made the historical records. It's not something that you go and then everybody record it. Like when you get a census in the mail, do you keep the paper for the historical record keeping later? Of course you don't. So it's like, great. We have two sources that say that the census of Quirinius did in fact happen. Josephus says that the census provoked the revolt of the Zealots. Luke says that the census was a few years earlier and the revolt of the Zealots was from someone else, was provoked by someone else. Okay, given that we have two conflicting sources, why on earth am I going to believe Josephus over Luke? Like, that is my theory. I think that everybody overthinks this. I think that everybody wants there to be some like super clever way to harmonize everything. And in fact, you need none of that. All you need to do is point out, oh yeah, Josephus was wrong. Luke was right. That's the answer. That's it. That's why there was that resolves all of the problems. And
Yep.
it's something to keep in mind. This is how I guess to end the stream. Like the whole point of this is that the reason that we take North seriously as a possibility, it's not like we have the weight of evidence that's the guy from Avon and the weight of evidence from North. No, we have some evidence that's the guy from Avon, a few quotes from a few scholars, and some contemporaries at the time, some vanishing thing, the fact that the names are very, very similar, and that he was an actor at the right time. It's good circumstantial evidence, plus Ben Jonson's inscription, right? Okay, that is good evidence, but if you have new evidence that overturns it, it's not so overwhelming that this would be like a sea change in Shakespearean scholarship. The fact is that I just mentioned all of the evidence. It's the guy from Avon. Now you go, well, we found the original works that are quoted in nearly every Shakespeare play, and they all belong to North. I mean, if this is correct, I feel like based on what we know, that's enough to overturn it. And what we shouldn't do is assume that just because all scholars agree that's the guy from Avon now, that it's based on like this abundance of historical evidence. That's not how methodology works, right? We'll call it the Rotten Tomatoes theory. You know, Rotten Tomatoes versus Metacritic, because the Metacritic evidence that's the guy from Avon is closer to 60-40. And now with the stuff from North, it might very well be swinging like 80-20 or 90-10 to North being the original author. Similarly, when we look at the Gospels and we go, oh, in historical methodology, the scholarly consensus is this. Well, you need to actually look at what the scholars are saying, what the weight of evidence is. Oh, the scholarly consensus is that Luke got the dating of Quirinius wrong. Right, but that scholarly consensus is based off of one other reference to the census of Quirinius from Josephus. It's not based on like a mountain of evidence that Luke is contradicting. It's not based on, like this massive, contemporary, well-known fact that Luke just got totally wrong. Like none of that's true.
It's basically like the Bible can't be right, the logic, right? So the Bible's wrong because there's a slightly different source that says, a different year,
Yeah, by
so the
the way, he
Bible.
would have been 4 years off, and this is like by far the worst historical contradiction we have in the New Testament. Like nothing else is
Wow.
even remotely close. And it's like a 4-year gap.
Which, even with the 4 year gap between the two of them, it doesn't actually change the events and what's the word I want? Like it doesn't noticeably change any events after the birth. The right people were still in the right places for all these things to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm trying to think of how to put it. Like, and it's the same thing with Exodus. When you look at things in the past, like we don't have a lot of archaeological evidence of Israel. There's the famous David Stela. I'm sure you know it since you've done some research into historical Israel. We have some we actually have archaeological evidence that David in fact did exist. And
Crazy.
obviously I think David did exist.
Yeah, because the Bible told me, Anthony. This may come as a complete shock, is that while I have done research in the area, like, quite frankly, it's like when people bring up whether or not Israel was, like, conquered by Egypt at times or turned into a vassal state. And I'm, like, looking over at the Bible, and it says, at this time, Pharaoh something something came up and put Judah to the sword, and it took the golden shields from the valley of Ekron and blah blah blah. It tore down the fences that David his father had, David his grandfather had built, and it's like, yeah, that's them raiding Judah and turning it into a vassal state. Well, they didn't say in the Bible that it was a vassal state. They basically showed up, ransacked them for loose change, and then left every year. Like, why in the world would you mention it? It's barely a tax. Oh, I don't know. The Bible should have used modern terminology. They should have used the words we use in the 20th century, don't you know?
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
We're both right. We've been
Yeah,
very
my
right.
my whole point was more like the archaeological evidence for the existence of Israel and for the existence of all of these things, like, is very scant. The problem is, like, of course it's very scant. Like, why on earth would it not be very scant? Like, you think that God would? I suppose you could say, well, if I were God, I would have preserved archaeological evidence. Like, well, God did preserve evidence. He observed very effective evidence. Actually, they wrote a fucking book about it. Like, what? What were you looking for? But that exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
You just didn't want to look at the Bible. Like, that's it. That's all you got to say, bro.
Moreover, when
I
you
don't
do
think
look at the Bible, this is another thing. Like, when you look at the Bible, it's actually like there's evidence in the text. What I mean is there is textual analysis that can be done. For example, Exodus is a good example because they've done a lot of this. Like, the linguistic analysis of Exodus shows that the names and the language used in Exodus has substantial Egyptian influence, as you would expect, right? It is this is the difference between it and the Book of Mormon, right? So the Book of Mormon, you will talk, clever Mormons can argue around this. So you might think, oh, well, it's so obviously fake, right? But there are a lot of, like, they'll do a lot of the same things, but here's the big difference. In the Book of Mormon, Mormons need to explain why the, like, translation count, I should say, of the Book of Mormon, like, supposedly it's translated from an Egyptian language. They need to explain why the language doesn't fit with what we would expect. They have very clever explanations for why, but nevertheless, what they're doing is explaining why it doesn't work. On the other hand, with Exodus, you don't need to do that. Exodus looks how you would expect that book to look if it were what it claimed to be. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah, that's the big difference between the two. Like, you don't need to play games with the Book of Exodus. You don't need to juggle things around and go like, oh, but, you could easily explain it by this or that, like you need to do with the Book of Mormon. Exodus looks how you would expect the book to look. The language used is the language you would expect to see used. Even the name Moses. Hey, guess what? You want to know what was a common suffix to names in Egypt at the time? Mose. You see it a lot. Remember the pharaoh we talked about earlier? Thutmose.
Ramses.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thutmose. Thutmose, like, Mose is a very commonly appearing name. The name Moses is, in fact, a name that was not at all out of place in Egypt at the time. They've done a similar analysis of Acts, of the names in Acts and the Gospels. Basically, they said, let's take a fictional book that was supposedly set in that time period of Acts and the Apostles, and let's look at the names actually used in Acts. So what percentage of names appear, like, what would we expect to see if Acts and the Gospels were actual works of fiction, of nonfiction, right? They were real, as opposed to a work of fiction. What percentage of names? Well, as it turns out, the percentage of names that appear in the book is exactly correct for what we would expect of a real document written about that time, a non-fiction fictional books are never that accurate with their names. Never. Not even the most well-researched book is going to get the proportion you would expect to see in that era exactly right. Acts and the Gospels, however, are precisely on point. The number of names that you would expect to see are exactly what you'd expect. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah, so that's where I'll end it. I find the whole Shakespeare thing more interesting as what it tells us about historical methodology. Similarly with the conflict over chess. While I am interested in both topics, it's purely on I find this subject kind of interesting level, right? It's not on a level that's ever going to really affect my life. However, there is some genuine intrigue here to me in terms of what it tells us about historical methodology. You need to be very careful when you read all scholars believe this, or it is generally agreed by scholars that, or even if they go scholars think this. Brant Petra talks about this in his book on if Jesus presents himself as God in the Gospels. The scholarly consensus is that in the synoptics, Jesus is not presented as God. However, as Brant Petra points out, when you actually look at every argument for that Jesus doesn't present himself as God, each individual argument is very, very poor. If you just accept what scholars say without actually looking at what they're saying, it can be very, very misleading. This is why I eventually turned away from even though I had in my Catholic high school, my Catholic Bible. Now we have a much better study Bible in the Ignatius Study Bible, which I highly recommend. But the one that I read in high school was a proponent of the JJ, I think it was called the Yahwist, Elohist, or the hypothesis. Basically, there were multiple authors of Genesis. And it is true that at the time, this was 100% the scholarly consensus. It was all the rage. But I am a writer nowadays. I've grown up to be a writer. And to me, this idea that different styles need to be written by different authors is horribly implausible. That doesn't track at all to me. That's so far from proof. So easy to imitate another style, especially if you're trying to make a different point in a religious text, right? So you change, this is a creation myth, so you write in a higher style. Well, this is going to zero in the specific part of the myth, so you change your writing style slightly. That's so plausible to me. The idea of multiple authors entering into it just does not enter my mind at all. And then I got a book by a scholar I actually respect a lot, Father James Harden. He wrote a book on Isaiah, and it looked interesting. It was a scholar, it was literally footnotes on Isaiah, and he's a highly respected scholar, and I respect him a lot, actually. But I stopped reading it, and he posited at one point that as many as 6 Isaiah authors. And I'm that's absolutely nuts. Where are you getting this from? And the answer is, oh, well, these are all written in slightly different ways. Now, it's true that there was probably an editor that compiled some stuff together, but who cares?
Or a scribe. Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, who cares? How are you getting 6 different authors from this, and how did nobody mention it until now?
I mean, he had a scribe. We know that he had friends helping him. It's not it's what I said about Shakespeare writing the things and having a dude just paid to write it down. It's but it's sorry, I'm trying to. Nope, I've lost it. Don't worry about it.
Yep. Anything you want to add before we go? I think I've made my point.
No, you made your point, and it made it pretty well. Like, we've gone over all the details. Like, we've sort of picked it up like a sphere and hit it at every angle that it's reasonable to hit at. The fact of the matter is that we know that it'll be propaganda when all of a sudden Shakespeare's a black gay transgender. Like, I guess it's just the price we have to pay to live in a diverse society, y'all. Don't you know?
Yeah, just saying
No,
Shakespeare isn't this commoner. He's this other commoner who's a white British guy.
right.
The last thing I will say, because I brought it up to you before, and I think it is kind of important to mention, if it is North, as far as I know, there's nothing about North being a secret Catholic. This is going to be devastating to all the, I think Shakespeare's actually Catholic theories.
Oh yeah.
Joseph Pierce, who, by the way, I have tremendous respect for. I actually recommend a lot of his stuff, but he was always a big proponent of, like, he was such a proponent of Shakespeare being Catholic. He was basically talking about it as if it was like an established fact, right? And I never bought it, at least not in. I always thought that the evidence in plays was incredibly sketchy. Like, yes, I do admit that there is a lot of like Catholic philosophy and theology that you could read in between the lines of Shakespeare's plays, but that's because Anglicanism, especially at the time, it was really not that different from Catholicism anyway. Certainly not, like, yeah, it was if you laid the doctrines out side by side, but if you're writing themes into a play, like, you're
Yep.
gonna come up on a lot of the same points. The second
Right.
problem, like, it is true, and this one was definitely more plausible, like, in terms of, I could believe that the bard from Avon might have been secretly Catholic, because we have pretty good evidence that his family was, like, that they were hiding priests. However, if the author was not the bard from Avon, it was North, that pretty much kills this theory.
Yeah.
I was never very convinced by it. It always struck me as, like, Catholics reaching for something they really wanted to be true. And it always felt too wish fulfillment, like, based to me.
Yeah.
Like, as it just so happens, the greatest writer in the history of the English language was also Catholic, and it's like,
You
we
guys
got
have
Dante, we're good.
right. You've got G.K. Chesterton. You guys should be happy.
Yeah, we got Chesterton in English, we got Dante in Italian, and honestly, that might actually be the greatest writer ever anyway. So it's like, you can have Shakespeare. Anything else?
No. So, like, for those who might doubt it, like, I dare you to go through the Pinkerton's Ghosts, not just to give us the views, but also figure out which ones of, like, Anthony's episodes I've written. You can't. Like, you would have to, like, deep study, like, soul kiss the different episodes that we've written for each other, and just figure it out. And what episodes did Anthony write of mine? Can you figure it out? The answer is that in reality, if you took the original episode and then you took something like Shaking Sinners' Hands, you might say, well, there's some definite differences. He wrote these over a period of 5 years, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But quite frankly, in the end, I know that I wrote all the episodes that I wrote with my own hand. And I wrote the first episode, and I certainly wrote Shaking Sinners' Hands. So, like, what does the study prove anything? In the end, we're common men. Let us act as common men and seek God rather than seek the approval of academics who, quite frankly, hate us anyway. If they're dishonest about the Bible, yeah.
I do want to say that this is one of my favorite, I don't want to say jokes per se, but one of my favorite points to make is the Gene Wolfe Bible analysis. So what I mean is, you go, pirate freedom was a later scholar is reading Gene Wolfe and goes, obviously there were at least 2 and possibly as many as 3 to 5 Gene Wolfes, right? The same author could not have written Private Freedom. Yeah,
Sorry,
the same author could not have written Pirate Freedom and Book of the New Sun. And then you go, oh, very interesting. So which book was written first? Well, just look at an analysis of the language. Pirate Freedom is in a much simpler style with much simpler themes and is much shorter and less complex. Obviously, Pirate Freedom was an early work, probably by the Wolf. We'll call him, right? We'll call him
The Alpha
Wolf, or
Wolf.
yeah, Alpha Wolf. Uh, and Book of the New Sun is clearly a work by the true master. We'll call him Prime Wolf,
Wolfpack.
right?
Wolfpack.
Prime Wolf, it was clearly a later and more mature work. I'm not saying there's no similarities. Clearly, he took inspiration from the earlier writer named Wolf. But there is no doubt, like, no scholar would disagree that Pirate Freedom is the earlier work. Like, how could it not be? Though a work of such depth and complexity of Book of the New Sun would surely not be the work of a new author. And who ever heard of an author going from a work of such complexity and then going to a work of such simplicity and basic language as Pirate Freedom? Therefore, I would concur that we have here at least two wolves. And then when you look at the other stuff, I suppose it's possible that the author of Pirate Freedom also wrote some of the other, niggling basic stuff. But I would posit at least three.
Possibly 5 to 7.
Yes, possibly 5 to 7. Let's not get started on the short stories.
Right.
And if you think about it, like, there is a serious point in there, which is that if you were to ask a random person to guess what came first, Pirate Freedom or Book of the New Sun, I would suspect that most people, without, unless they were going, is this a trick? But, like, if they were being honest with themselves, right, would say Pirate Freedom was probably written first, right? Which would be entirely and totally wrong. Pirate Freedom was written way, way later by a much more mature Gene Wolfe. Book of the New Sun was the much earlier work.
Yep.
So you got to be very, very, very careful with this stuff. Like, the obvious answer is not always the correct one.
Yep. And we'll leave it at that. All right, guys. We got some plans down the way that we're going to be working on. We're definitely going to do Eucharist stream when Anthony gets less busy and he can spend the time on it. Because it is an important statement of our faith, how it's done, what is it done for, the idea that any sacrament is not important to the Christian experience is risible, laughable, to be denied. Remember, folks, and we'll end with this. You don't have to argue with people who are wrong. Sometimes you can just let them be wrong. Because, quite frankly, as the good book says, if you argue with stupid people, you also look stupid. Foolish, perhaps, is the word they used. Good night.